Hello folks, this is David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com, your pub chess bluffer. Very much chilling out on the coffee today as I've had a bit of a hectic week. Lots of chess and also a mahjong competition I was involved in. So today I am staying at home, chilling out, having a quiet day and making this and I hope other videos. I'm reporting in this video on the fifth game I played in a 7-game mini tournament, if you like, which took place last weekend at Aster Plaza here in Hiroshima, was hosted by these fine people from a chess club in Osaka. And the fifth game of this tournament saw me looking for my second point. So in the first 4 games, I lost the first game playing as black. I won the second game playing as white. That was the Saturday. And on the Sunday, we had 3 games. And the first 2 games, I played as black and I lost each game. So I was feeling bruised and battered. I've reported on those games in other videos. And I go into my 5th game as white, looking for a second point to lift me up from close to the bottom of the league table in our mini tournament. I was playing the only other unrated player in the competition. I was one of the unrated players, and my opponent in this game was the other unrated player, and his name is Matsuoka. And I opened with d4, as I usually do when I'm playing white, and my opponent responded with knight f6, and we'll go through these moves quite quickly. It gets us into the King's Indian defense. Now, in the King's Indian defense, I follow the advice of John Watson, who says in the 4th move, it's a nice little thing to do to move h3, following the example of Karpov. I think it was Karpov who brought in this little innovation. It's a modest little move, but it does something rather important. It contests control of g4, and g4 is a square that both the knight and the bishop have their eye on, the black knight and the black bishop are looking at this as a possible landing square. So h3, a modest little move, prevents that from happening. Okay, after that we have the standard knight bishop to g7 followed by e4. White is seeking to claim control of the center here. This pawn, the e4 pawn, is protected by my knight on c3 against the interest, as it were, of the knight on f6. My opponent castled. I move my bishop to e3, knight b to d7, knight f3, and then we get this early c pawn break. But I respond, as Lichess recommends, by advancing my d-pawn. And this triangular structure of white central pawns is very much a feature of the King's Indian game. We then see what I think is a weakening move. Lichess also doesn't like it very much. It wasn't one of the 2 recommended moves by Lichess. My opponent moved his knight out to b6, perhaps looking at this pawn here, though the pawn is defended by my bishop. I indeed respond, as Lichess recommends, by moving my bishop up to d3, and then we get e6, which is a fairly common move in this opening. I castle, and e takes d5. As you can see, we then have a choice of which pawn to take back with, if indeed we're going to take. It would also be possible to take with the knight. Lichess seems somewhat to favour taking with the c-pawn, but I prefer to take with the e-pawn, the reason being that it opens up this diagonal here. So I have these 2 diagonals with my 2 bishops, my d3 and e3 bishop are contesting those diagonals. And so play continues with rook to c2, and indeed with the queen on c2 supporting the d3 bishop, strengthening white's claims to that diagonal, which is being contested by the pawns on h7 and g6. However, I decided to play what I have named the melody move, which is queen to d2. This is what Melody did. Melody is one of the other players in this tournament and was my first opponent. I made a video about our game in which Melody won as white, and she used this maneuver, queen to d2. Queen and bishop now strong on this diagonal, with the idea of attacking this g7 bishop and seeing if black is willing to swap it off, or under what circumstances black will swap it off, whether black will take my bishop when it lands on h6, or whether black will let me take his bishop on g7. The reply was queen to c7, not one of Lichess's recommended moves, and you can see the advantage is slipping more and more into white's favor. I moved my bishop to f4, and we then had bishop to d7, a4, the advance of the a pawn, eyeing up this badly placed knight as I consider it, looking to advance here. If black does not respond with a5 at this stage, I can advance my pawn and push the knight away from the center of the board, push the knight probably onto the back rank. So my opponent did not respond with h5 as I expected him to, but instead put his knight, sorry, that would be a5. My opponent did not respond with a5 as I expected, but places knight on h5, attacking or threatening my bishop. My bishop is, of course, protected by my queen, but I decide, as Lichess recommends, to go ahead with the bishop to h6 move that I mentioned earlier. And my opponent felt that his move had been a mistake, and so instead of this important a5 move, he moved his knight back where it had come from. And so there is a marked loss of tempo on the part of black here. If we compare that move with the a5 move, that keeps my pawn away from the knight over here. And then when I take the bishop, black has the choice of, actually Lichess is recommending that the king take the bishop to probably keep the knight out further forward. But he does have the choice of taking back with the knight. Lichess doesn't like that move very much. And the knight from there could perhaps come forward to one of these squares. However, that did not happen, and it looks as if Lichess doesn't think much of the idea anyway. My opponent moved his knight back to f6. I then took the bishop, and the king took back. Now, since nothing had happened over on the A file, I advanced my pawn to A5, forcing black's knight back to C8. Now, what that means is that not only is the knight on the knight is right at the back of the board, and so away from influencing any immediate influence of the center. The knight has also broken the connection between the two rooks. And so the only thing which is protecting this rook here is the bishop. And I take advantage of that. I take advantage of that by first moving my knight back. My opponent moves his knight in, and then after that exchange, I will occupy the file here. But let's just go back to look at how all that happened. I'm moving my knight over, heading for g3. Excuse me. My opponent jumps in with his knight to e4, attacking the queen, but it's one of those kind of one idea attacks. He saw that with his knight here, he can attack my queen, quite possibly forcing the queen to move, or forcing an exchange of bishop for knight. Now, I was quite happy to exchange here. The rook comes down, but that enables me to get in this check, placing my queen on a very nice diagonal. And this queen on this A1 H8 diagonal becomes a static benefit for me, a static asset. I'm going to keep the queen on that nice long diagonal, dominating the A1 to H8 diagonal. And with this check, the king is forced to move back. And so the king moves back to G8. I then get in my knight to G3 move with tempo, forcing the rook back to E8. And then I can occupy the E file. I'm now claiming possession or challenging for possession of this E file here. My opponent is looking for some counterplay on the B file, and I simply take the rook. The bishop takes back. Now we have an unprotected bishop here at E8, and you can see Lichess is recommending, one of the moves that Lichess is recommending is to place my rook on that nice open file there, which is exactly what I do. So we now have these two very nice zones of influence, if you like. I have the queen on that diagonal, I have the rook on this nice file, and my two knights are well placed to advance and take further control of the center. So my opponent moves his bishop away to D7, which means he's able to protect the E8 square. I then strengthen my pawn chain. It's a little intermediate move, probably not necessary, but actually what I'm thinking is I was expecting the B pawn to advance to B4 to force my queen to move. And so the reason why I advanced to strengthen the pawn chain was also, and perhaps more importantly, to provide some retreat squares for the queen, which will keep her on this diagonal here, which is, of course, a diagonal that enables her to dominate the game. But my opponent didn't advance his pawn. He moved his queen back to add further protection to the E8 square. I then move my knight to E4. Now here, with my knight on E4, if the king doesn't move, the knight can come into F6 and check the king. And the king will be forced to move, and in that move there lies considerable danger. If the king moves to H8 or to G7, my knight can take the black bishop on D7, and we have a discovered check coming down here. And so I pick up a free piece. If to avoid that, however, the king moves to F8 in response to my knight's checking move. Then my knight can come in here and take the H7 pawn and check the king again. And we now have the knight on H7 and the queen dominating that diagonal. And in moving my knight, of course, I should add that this file here also becomes open to my rook. So there's the rook's influence on the file, the queen's influence on the diagonal, and the knight has just picked up a piece over here. My opponent thought for a while and decided at this point it would be the right time to resign. And so it was game over, and second point for me, which moved me up into the lower reaches of the middle of the table by the end of Sunday. So on each of the first 2 days, I had managed to win a game as white, and my tally at this stage was 3 losses as black and 2 wins as white in the 5 games that I had played. Okay, folks, I hope you enjoyed that video, and I will make 2 more videos in this series to take us through to the end of the Hiroshima Open Chess Tournament that took place in Astor Plaza on the weekend of the 21st to 23rd of September 2019. That's all from me, David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com.